The interstellar starship Avalon may be seen sailing through space, bound for a colonized world known as Homestead 2. All of its quarters are unoccupied, and the ship is on autopilot. The 258 crew members and 5,000 passengers are in hibernation. Suddenly, the ship travels through an asteroid belt, which weakens its shields. Power is sent to the primary shield, but the ship is on a collision path with a massive asteroid. Suddenly, an asteroid collides with the ship, creating a variety of faults. The ship begins to fix itself, but one of the hibernation pods activates. Jim Preston, a mechanical engineer, was the passenger who was awakened. His pod opens, and an automatic mechanism assists him in waking up, informing him that he has been in suspended animation for 120 years, and that the ship is only 4 months away from Homestead 2. He is promised that he will be able to spend that time enjoying the ship's exquisite amenities. Jim is given details concerning his ID band, his cabin, and the key activities he will participate in before to his arrival on the planet. Excited and frightened to meet the people on the ship, he prepares, leaves his stateroom, and enters an automated lesson designed for a large learning group. Jim appears concerned as the hologram describes the situation on Earth, calling it overcrowded, costly, and overdone. It urges him to save his questions for the end of the lesson, but Jim keeps wondering why he's the only one there. He knows the hologram cannot respond to him and searches for other people. He arrives at the ship's main concourse. No one is present, but an automated information desk offers assistance. Jim requests to speak with a human person, and the system directs him to a steward. But when he discovers that no one else is present, he requests to speak with the captain. When he arrives at the bridge, despite the fact that he is unable to enter, he notices that none of the primary crew is awake. Jim ultimately visits the observatory, where he learns that the ship is actually 90 years away from Homestead 2. He thinks he awoke too soon, so he hurries back to the concourse and sends a message to Earth, wondering what he should do because he has no idea how to return to sleep. The communication technology informs him that the price he called to Earth will take about 55 years to receive a response. Jim is devastated. He walks around till he reaches the ship's bar, where he meets another individual. Something about him strikes me as unusual when he speaks to the bartender. When Jim tries to get him a drink, he finds he is an android. His name is Arthur. Jim wants to learn more from him, but he can't explain to the robot how he was able to arrive ahead of schedule. The next day, Jim wakes up in his cabin and walks to the cantina, only to discover that the majority of the items on the menu are only available to gold-class travelers. He gets some ordinary coffee and attempts to figure out how to repair his hibernation chamber. After gathering all of the necessary tools, he successfully operates the device and lies down inside the pod, but nothing happens. Next, he decides to utilize the equipment he obtained to get access to the crew's hibernation chambers, but this too fails. Small problems occur throughout the ship. Jim keeps going to the bar to drink, but largely to converse with Arthur. The android offers him some counsel, which persuades him to break into one of the gold-class rooms and have some fun aboard the ship. Jim tries every restaurant, game, and entertainment system. However, as time passes, he gets increasingly dissatisfied with being alone. One day, he becomes intoxicated and walks around the hibernation pods. When Jim falls into an airlock containing spacesuits built for spacewalks, he puts on the suit, goes to the airlock, pushes a lever, and then presses the button to open the door. When he steps outside the ship, he is captivated by the vista. He is the sole cognizant human being at that point in time. Jim releases the magnets from his boots and floats in space, distraught. He returns inside, removes the suit, but continues to the airlock without it. He pulls the lever, intending to end it all, but changes his mind at the last minute, goes back inside, and slips on a bottle. Jim stands up and is instantly drawn to Aurora, a woman in one of the pods. He looks for her files in the directory and listens to her passenger interview, falling for her. Later, while sitting next to her pod and still listening to her interviews at the bar, he reads some of her work and speaks with Arthur about her writing. He becomes preoccupied with the absurdity of his situation. He travels to another planet in search of a better life, wakes up early, fails to arrive, and finds his ideal girlfriend just to lose her. Jim continues to think about her and begins to consider waking her awake as well. He discusses it with the android, but Arthur doesn't comprehend the problem. If he wakes her awake for his own gain, he will leave her to die on the ship with him. Jim first decides against it, but as time passes, he finds himself unable to let go. Until one day, he reconsiders his decision. He walks to her pod and successfully activates it. As she wakes up and goes through the same process he did, He hides and returns to his room. A little later, he travels to the main concourse, expecting to see her, and there she is, as perplexed as he was a year before. Jim assures her they are the only ones awake and brings her to the observatory. Then he tells her that he is unable to contact the crew or the ship's primary commands. Aurora freaks out and wants to return to her pod. When they arrive there, Jim explains that there is no special technology on the spacecraft that can let them return to hibernation, effectively notifying her that they are stranded. They return to the concourse, and he informs her that she should rest because she has just emerged from hibernation. She feels terrible for him because he has to spend more than a year alone on the ship. Jim returns to the bar, regretful of what he did. He requests Arthur not to inform Aurora that he woke her up. The next day, Aurora wakes up, returns to the concourse, and inquires about the hibernation pods at the automated information desk. Jim joins her there, and they go for breakfast. As they leave, the information desk experiences a problem. In the cantina, Aurora notices that Jim has been eating the same breakfast for over a year and orders one of the gold-class menus. They discuss the prospect of mending the pods, but Aurora, unlike Jim, is not willing to give up. She examines the infirmary, then goes through research records, eventually arriving at the crew's hibernation rooms and attempting to burst the doors open. Jim detects further faults throughout the ship. Later, Aurora laments her existence on the Avalon. She writes, jogs around the ship, and swims in the pool, becoming increasingly aware of her surroundings. She walks to the cantina to interview Jim, believing that his story will be interesting. She questions why he came to the colony. Jim initially responds with company buzzwords, but then goes on to say that he wishes to be somebody in the new world and make a life. They eventually arrive at the observatory, where Aurora explains why she is there. Unlike the rest of the passengers on the ship, she has a round-trip ticket. Her plan was to travel to Homestead 2, live there for a year, and then return to Earth to become the first journalist to do so, writing the greatest story of all time. Aurora gradually loses hope of resolving their current situation, and Jim devises a plan to cheer her up. He takes her dancing, to the movie theater, and to the basketball court. Finally, he takes her to the bar, where she meets Arthur. She relaxes for a moment before remembering their circumstances. Jim is left alone with the android, feeling terrible about what he has done to her. The next instant, he's seen tinkering with something, and the next, Aurora enters the observatory to discover a miniature of the Chrysler building he built for her. Later, they go on a date to the pub. They have dinner and tell stories about their lives. She informs him that her father died when she was a teenager. After supper, Jim takes Aurora to the airlock, where they put on their spacesuits. They go out on a spacewalk together. Jim now has someone to share his beautiful experience with. Jim turns off the magnets in their boots, and they float together in space. They return inside and instantly kiss before retreating to his cabin and sleeping together. Soon later, they begin living as a couple. Aurora moves into his cabin. They jog, dine, and sleep together. Jim investigates the ship further and discovers the hydroponics bay. He once brought flowers to Aurora. The ship passes by a red giant, so they head to the observatory to see it. It's Aurora's birthday, so they celebrate later that night at one of the ship's various restaurants before heading to the bar. Jim goes to the restroom and prepares the ring he made for Aurora, while she remains in the bar, conversing with Arthur. The android informs Aurora that Jim purposefully woke her up, forgetting that he was still required to keep it a secret. Jim reappears, and she confronts him in complete bewilderment. She flees, enraged and terrified. Jim returns to his cabin to discover all of her belongings gone. He runs into her in the cafeteria the next day, but the moment he talks, she flees. Aurora is desperate. One night, she walks over to Jim's cabin and punches and kicks him, wanting to kill him for talking to her over the phone since she avoids him. Jim apologizes and explains his actions to her. He tells her that he fell in love with her, but Aurora doesn't care. She cannot forgive him for taking her life. Another failure occurs one night while Jim is inside his cottage. The spacecraft experiences a critical error, and the primary command terminates. Later, he enters the elevator, and it malfunctions. Aurora walks into the main concourse and notices that Jim has planted a tree there. Then she visits the cantina, where the food dispensary is likewise malfunctioning. Suddenly, they both hear the deck chief's voice over the intercom, asking who planted the tree. They both rush into the concourse and spot Gus Manzo standing in front of Jim's tree. They present themselves and brief the chief on the situation. He doesn't see how 3 pods could fail. Manzo leads them to the bridge, where he determines that there is a problem with the spacecraft, but the system's information must be manually reviewed. When they depart the bridge, a robot nearly falls on their heads, and the two of them inform Manzo that breakdowns have become more prevalent throughout the ship. He argues that shouldn't happen as he demonstrates how to collect the data. When Jim arrives, the man checks on the pods. He figured out what happened to Aurora's pod. The deck chief considers Jim's actions to be horrible. When Aurora arrives, he is at the bridge, checking the collected data. They discuss what happened to her pod, but he says he can't do anything about it. Jim enters with the 16th broken robot. Manzo feels the hibernating sickness and retires to rest, but as he steps out, he coughs up blood. Aurora can't sleep that night, so she goes swimming instead. Suddenly, there is gravity loss throughout the ship, and she begins to die as the water from the pool travels about her. The gravity drive restarts, and she narrowly escapes alive. They stumble into each other on their way to find Manzo. The three of them are back on the bridge, slowly figuring out what has been going on with the ship. Manzo discovers that something happened 2 years ago, destroying a critical system. They must identify and repair the source of the problem, as the entire ship is attempting to pick up the slack. If they don't fix it, the entire vessel will become stranded. They go to investigate the problem, but Manzo collapses, so Jim and Aurora take him to the hospital. He is dying, and there are no medicines that can prevent it or extend his life. Later, the three of them meet in the observatory and Manzo hands Jim his ID bracelet, instructing him to fix the ship, and he dies. Suddenly, the lights turn an alarming red, and the ship begins to shake. Jim tells Aurora that he needs her help, and they rush to engineering, but the gravity drive fails again. Arthur is also affected by the immediate tell. Jim deactivates him. They finally arrive at engineering and begin searching for the problem. They find it in the power plant, and as they open the hatch, Aurora is sucked into. The asteroid produced a breach in the hull in that location. Jim is also sucked in, but he clings onto the hatch as it continues to close around him. He eventually gets sucked in, but they quickly close the opening. Jim finds there is more than one breach in the hull just after he fixes the problem. They follow the meteor's trajectory and discover that it has collided with the reactor control computer. Jim believes he can obtain replacement parts for it. They discover and replace the part, but the reactor venting procedure continues to fail. They try it manually, but it fails again. Jim realizes he needs to open the vent door from the outside of the ship so they can cool down the reactor. Both of them head to the airlock, and as he prepares to go, he hands Aurora Manzo's bracelet because he might not return. She assists him with the suit, and as he enters the airlock, she instructs him to return since she cannot live on the ship without him. Aurora returns to the reactor, where temperatures have reached critical levels. A bolt from the reactor pierces her arm as Jim approaches the vent from the outside and notices the door. The temperature in the reactor room rises as he attempts to open the vent door by bypassing it. He quickly understands he'll have to manually hold the door open so the reactor can vent, and informs Aurora. She dislikes the plan, but he was ahead with it and instructs her to vent the reactor. She does not want him to die and they dispute, but he insists that they save the other people, so she vents the reactor. The process is effective, but the fumes from the reactor push Jim away, breaking his bond. The pressure in his suit is also reducing. He informs Aurora what occurred, and she rushes to another suit and brings him in. He apologizes to her again. She puts on a suit and flies out to retrieve him, but her tether is too short. She's pulled back, but she takes his rope and pulls him in. Aurora drags Jim inside the infirmary, only to discover that he has already died. She uses Manzo's wristband to bypass medical procedures and resurrect him. The medical pod does the procedure automatically and revives Jim. Aurora forgave him. Aurora eventually repairs Arthur, and they give Manzo a suitable space burial. Jim takes her to the infirmary and informs her that he has discovered a way to use the medical pod as a sleep chamber. He tells her to crawl inside the pod and spend the rest of the journey there, but as it turns out, she resists and chooses to stay awake on the ship. Jim finally proposes to her, and they spend their lives on the ship. 88 years later, the Avalon arrives at Homestead 2. The crew awakens to discover the ship in an unexpected state. Aurora gives them a note telling them about her and Jim's existence aboard the ship while the others were sleeping.